All right, good morning. I thought I'd start our day today with a little public speaking on your part. So if you notice in your booklet, there is directions for a self-presentation speech. You're going to do a short self-introduction where you're going to tell us your name, the class you want to add public speaking to, and then someone who you would like to meet from history and why. A lot of us chose people that are sort of associated with our field. So having your students do a similar sort of thing. Think about someone in the field who they have liked to read. It would be interesting to see what they know and what they don't know. Graduate students in particular would be good at that. My students actually are going to give self-introductions next week where they're going to take, it's a prepared one, so not one that's impromptu like this, where they're going to take a piece of text and then tell us why it's important to them. And the example I gave them is a quotation I used to carry around when I was a college student, which said, "I am different for having seen the moon rise on the other side of the world," and then talk about how my experience with travel has changed who I am as a person. So doing those kinds of things impromptus to get them up in front. One of the other things that I always say also is we often have students talk in groups, right? Like, so here's a question, talk with your friends. Have them move around the room. Don't have them always stay in the same group because they become familiar with the people at their table, but they may not know the person that's on the other side of the room. And so having people move into different groups actually gets them then communicating with other people in the room to create that community, right? So now I know who you are. Because one of the things that brings that anxiety down, of course, is being familiar with that person, with the other people. So that they aren't strangers that you're looking at across the room. You're looking at people who you actually know who they are. I think all of us who do a lot of public speaking realize that that anxiety is something we can turn into the energy that helps us get through the presentation. But the old adage is true that people fear public speaking more than they fear death. So Seinfeld makes a really funny joke about that, right? That you'd rather be in the casket than deliver the eulogy. So. And I think that, you know, it's a nice way to sort of think about just at face value what it is that your students are facing as they think about giving presentations in your class. I wanted to kind of focus this first part of today around that issue of anxiety and some of the things that you can do to help students overcome that anxiety as they look towards the presentations that they have to do both in your class and then outside as well. Anxiety actually causes any number of kind of difficulties, I think, for students, right? You have the standard, I can't look at you. My favorite are the students who have adopted some behaviors to help them manage that. So for instance, their eye contact isn't at people, right? It's at the back of the room. So you get a speech where the entire practice goes like this, so that they're looking beyond you and there's no connection. I've had students break out in hives. I've had students who shake so much that they can't read their notes, right? Some of this probably sounds familiar. I think the single most common thing that happens around anxiety is dry mouth. Have you all experienced dry mouth before? It's incredibly difficult. Your mouth gets so dry that all we get is the smacking as you're talking. And so one of the things that I really want to stress is that combating anxiety actually starts well before they're giving a presentation. In particular, I think one of the most important parts about helping students overcome that anxiety is actually creating an environment or a community for them where the anxiety is acknowledged, but it's addressed so that it's a safe place, right? The class becomes a safe place to do something that is so anxiety producing. Or for instance, if you're having your graduate students practice presentations that ultimately, right, they're going to give to a room full that is really scary, that first time they get that practice in front of a group of people who they know is committed to helping them out. So the second thing I want to stress is that the other thing that helps students overcome anxiety, frankly, is just making them do it, getting up in front of a group of people and talking. So the more opportunities that you offer your students to practice public speaking, the better they will be at public speaking. So the things we're going to talk about here in the next couple of minutes are sort of focused on those two concepts, creating that community environment that's safe and offering opportunities for your students to practice, and practice in particular ways, actually, to help them overcome so that when they come to the big moment, they're ready, they're prepared for that. So one of the things I've got in here for you actually is an anxiety inventory. And this is a tool I actually use with my students often to start a conversation about communication anxiety. So I've got it in the book for you. So what I thought we'd do is go ahead and fill it out, actually. It asks you a series, 21 statements, and you're doing the Likert scales, filling out the numbers. I love teaching 20 to 24 students. When I get to 50 or more, it's a little bit harder for me, because one of the things that I really like about that 24 student is I get to develop relationships, right? As an extrovert, we're connected, I'm getting a lot of excitement and energy from working with the students. My husband is an introvert who hates teaching 24 students because it's too many people in a room for him, right? It requires a lot more energy for him to be engaged with that number of students. He, however, teaches a 250-person lecture and loves it, because what he gets to do is walk in, talk, and walk out the door, right? That doesn't mean he doesn't actually have contact with the students, but it's a little different than what happens in a 20 to 24. So that's, I think, something that's interesting about public speaking. One of the other ways that I use this measure actually is to get the students to talk about their results, right? So how many of you scored here? How many of you scored at this place? How many of you were struck by? Did you realize this? And talking through what does it mean to have sort of anxiety about all of these interactions? Because having that conversation allows the students to realize that they are not the only ones in the room who have that anxiety, and probably aren't the only ones in the room who may have a high degree of anxiety about something. And I've also had students have a response to it where they didn't realize that they weren't actually as anxious as they thought, right? The minute they started answering the questions, they were like, oh, okay, yeah, I can do this. So I use this measure as a place to start the conversation. And again, it's about creating that community, right? We're all in this boat together. We all have this kind of sense of anxiety. Now, together, what are some strategies that we can do to overcome that? So how do we function as a community to help each other overcome that? So it's often a place for me to start a conversation about, okay, if you've done public speaking before, what are some of the things that you've done to help yourself with being anxious? Another tool I use for students with anxiety is actually to get them up in front of the class where there isn't a grade associated with it, so that it's giving them an opportunity to get up in front and talk without having the burden of feeling like this is going to make or break my GPA. I really make it clear what my expectations are for them as audience members. One of the kind of key components of being a public speaker, I argue to my students, is being a good audience member. So when you think about being a good audience member, what are some of the behaviors that are sort of do's and don'ts of being a good audience member? I can think of one right away. On the first day of classes, I had 5 students texting in a small room. And I'm sarcastic enough, I guess, is my response to them was, really? We couldn't wait 3 weeks to show me your bad behavior? And they all kind of looked at me, and I was like, seriously, people, I can see you. This is a small room. I want the students to know that I take it seriously, that I know that they're going to be anxious in this room. And it's one thing for them to do it to me. They will never do it to each other. That's not allowed. One of the other things that I do is for every public speaking assignment, a component of their grade is their behavior as an audience member. And I have gone so far as docking a full letter grade penalty for misbehavior as an audience member, because it lets the other students know that you mean business, right? If I'm anxious, then but I know my teacher's got my back. I very rarely have had to actually yell at students, because I dislike that, right? It sort of sets up, it can sometimes set up sort of a community element there as well, that I'm mean, but sometimes you have to be. The next page here is an ethical code for public speaking. And this is rooted in an assignment actually that I generate with my students. And a lot of that has to do with asking them to be an audience member that is responsive. So one of the things that I talk about in class is good audience behavior, good listening behaviors. And one of those is maintaining eye contact. The others are sort of positive nonverbal feedbacks, right? So nodding your head, shaking your head, saying, yeah, that's interesting, or letting your audience know, or letting your speaker know that you're actually paying attention to what they have to say. And funny enough, when you practice those behaviors, you actually do listen, right? Because you're waiting for those moments. And so having an explicit conversation with your students about what does it take to be good audience members. And why might you want to be that good audience member? Well, you want to support each other because you know how hard it is to be up here, right? So I'm going to do everything I can as a student to help support you as you're up in the front, because I'm going to want you to do the same thing for me. It's about that relationship. My students fill out audience reactions for every speech that they see. So every public presentation, there's an audience reaction form, and I guide those questions. So sometimes it'll be something like, you know, of all the arguments you heard today, which one did you think was the most interesting and why? If you could have made one of the presentations today, what would be one thing that you would do different and why? So asking them to have and that's part of their grade as well, or it's part of their participation. So asking those kinds of questions to get them focused, because it's hard. You know, there are times when I teach a class where there are 10 presentations in a day, and that's difficult. Our attention span wanders. And also I think it's difficult for students because particularly when you have that many presentations at once, right? I noticed this about when you ask people what order they want to speak in, you can also sort of get a sense of who has what sorts of levels of anxiety about public speaking, right? And it isn't necessarily true that a person who speaks first is the least anxious. They may actually be one of the most anxious. They just want to get it done and out of the way, right? And so it's like ripping off a Band-Aid. I'll just get up there and get it done and then I don't have to. But others kind of want to ease into it. I want to see what other people do so that I can model my behavior, you know. And then there's the holdout that's like, really seriously, maybe she won't notice that I'm here and they won't make me do this. But so what happens for students is that if there's someone who has a presentation later, they're thinking about their presentation the whole time. So that's why they're doing this, right? Because they're focused on what their task is next. And so I will have that questionnaire, so it's asking them to engage their classmates. They have to write down a question for every presentation, or if you can do it, you schedule one presentation a day, right? If you have group presentations, there's one presentation per class period. I think part of that anxiety actually has to do with that they're worried that what they're going to say sounds dumb, right? Because it's harder to think on your feet that way. You have to listen to, and I think a lot of it has to do with that listening, is that they don't know how to listen and sort of critically engage. Whenever we talk about critical engagement, I think the immediate response is, if I'm to ask a question, then my job is to tell you what you did wrong, right? Because that's what it means to critically engage something. Instead of understanding that it's to take seriously what someone said and respond in a sort of in a curiosity, in a, you know, can you explain this further? I was struck by this, and so move forward this way. So one of the things might be to think about debunking this notion of a critical engagement, because it doesn't mean I'm telling you what you did wrong. It's I'm interested in what you had to say. So instead, the question is about the interest, not about the here's where I would have done that differently. Write them down. Instead of having to think it through, right, and having it stuck in your head, having something that you write down might also help with that. But I think sort of reframing what's the purpose of that is a way to sort of help to overcome that. Take a moment and take a breath. That's going to help with every anxiety-producing situation that you've got. Never, ever feel like you have to fill the quiet space. Silence is hard, particularly when you're in a circumstance where you've got 20 people looking at you, right? All these sets of eyes. Oh, I got to come up with something. So for every time for questions, I tell students the most important thing is to take a breath first. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. The next thing should be, I wonder if it might be this, you know, or this is how I would answer it right now, to get that answer, and then taking that moment of a breath. And again, it's unfortunately, or sort of fortunately, always the other component of this is the opportunity to have it happen, right? The more practice that you get, having it happen and realizing that the world doesn't end when it does happen is going to make you feel more confident about it. Good public speakers aren't born, they're made. It takes practice. It takes a lot of practice. So think how often you all are up in front, and remember back to that first time you had to get up in front of a group of people. One of the things that I think is really difficult for students is that to listen to something that they don't agree with, right? Because they don't agree with it. And so one of the things that we talk about is that being a good audience member is actually risky. It risks, if I'm asking you to change your mind, then I also have to be willing to risk that you're going to change mine, is sort of what we talk about in talking about that as a responsibility as an audience member. I've done it where we as a class take a chunk of time and I talk about audience behavior and appropriate audience behavior, and then we talk about the sort of community development here. So they generate the list. It can take a class period. It can take 10 minutes. It can take 20 minutes. I've had students write their own for themselves. So everybody writes it like a contract and then they sign it. I've had the class come up with it and then everybody signs it. And I've also done it where it's part of the deal, right? We're doing public speaking in here, so here's an ethical code, and I talk through why that ethical code exists. Everybody signs it. But, because you're right, you have to have buy-in for it. So it's going to take as long as you want or as short as you want, but at least as long as you're using it to frame a conversation. In particular, I think most of them understand the responsibilities that they have as speakers, but the concept that they have responsibilities as an audience member is very different. The other thing that I also tell students in terms of their responsibility as a speaker is that they are in control of the room. Whenever they're giving a speech up in front, they're in control of the room. So if someone is doing something that is distracting to you, you have the right to very graciously ask them not to do that anymore. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, please tell me after the speech, and I will certainly talk to that student. It's interesting to see how that empowers students. So I've had students before stop and just say, you know, I realize I think that you're paying attention, but you're on your phone and it's really distracting me, so can you stop so that I can continue? Which when it comes from their fellow classmates, right, that's infinitely more meaningful than it is. Because for me, it just sounds like I'm being rude, right? I have all these rules, those teachers. But as a student, they're setting that, because it's, again, about that community. And I think a lot of it has to do with that empowerment for themselves. One of the things I wanted to highlight about, as we listen to what sort of constitutes a great public speaker, all of those kinds of things are things that you can build into the assignment and the assessments of those. One of the things I often get asked by students is, what are you looking for when you grade my presentation, right? Maybe some of you have heard that as well. What is it that you're looking for? What are you going to grade in my presentation? Like, are you going to pay attention to delivery? Are you going to pay attention to content? And my response is always, you know, it doesn't matter what you say, if you can't say it clear enough for us to understand it, but no amount of beautiful public speaking is going to hide the fact that you said nothing, like that there was no argument there, right? I don't care how pretty and elegant it is, if you said nothing, you said nothing. And so what I stress to my students is that it's both. They work hand in hand, right? So you need to have that ability to present the material clearly, cogently, and you also need to have constructed an argument that actually made it possible for you to do that delivery. I'm not sure that they always get that concept, right? That what they prepare for the speech actually impacts how it sounds when they say it, right? How they sound when they give the speech. Every presentation should have 3 parts. You're going to tell them what you're going to tell them, you're going to tell them, and then you're going to tell them what you told them. Because unlike writing, for a speech, of course, as you know, you don't have a text in front of you. So I can't hit rewind and say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that point, beep, like you can when you're reading an essay. And so one of the things I think that's hardest for students to do is to put that organizational structure within it. So having an introduction that has an attention step to it that's relevant to the audience, you offer a preview of your main points, you're giving a thesis, just even making an argument. I'm struck how often I see presentations where the argument happens at the end. Because just like with writing, right, it was a draft and they wrote themselves into the claim. And so then instead of coming back and putting the argument at the beginning, they didn't do that. And so then we're lost, right? I spent 7 minutes like, I wonder what we're talking about here. So let's watch a speech. This is from the TED Talks. Have any of you ever seen TED Talks? I love this resource. It's a resource of just a huge amount of speeches, actually, and they vary in length from between 20 minutes to shorter. We're going to watch one here today that's only 4 minutes long. The suits that young women can buy are phenomenally problematic because it's about cleavage and legs. It's not about... And that's a hard conversation to have. And unfortunately, I think it works the same for the men as well, but in a different way, right? They end up being very frumpy. It's hard to pick an outfit as well. And so I also talk about things like, you know, what do you want your audience to be paying? I ask the question, when you're up there presenting, what is it that you want your audience to be paying attention to while you're giving the presentation? And try really hard not to say, seriously, let's think this through a little bit. Yeah, I talk with my students about getting that balance between being true to themselves and then reflecting the kind of importance of the event, right? And so often what will happen is that they choose to wear clothing because they think it is going to make them look more professional, but they're uncomfortable in it. And if you're uncomfortable giving a public presentation that you're already uncomfortable giving, then it's not going to work. You're going to be thinking about the fact that you're uncomfortable. And so you have to balance those two things together in terms of looking nice and appropriate, but also, feeling comfortable and confident in what it is that you're wearing. The other thing that not a lot of people think about, and is something that I talk a lot about with my students, and it comes with knowing how you behave as a public speaker, is clothing and jewelry and other things can actually become distractions to you as you're speaking. I had a student once who every speech she gave, 5 speeches, she took her jewelry off, all of her jewelry off, all of the rings, all of the bracelets, the watch, the necklace, the earrings came off, and then halfway through the speech, she put it all back on again. And when I told her she was doing it, she was like, that's not true. I mean, I play with my jewelry, but I don't do that. And I had to actually have her watch the video for her to see. It was such an unconscious, and the moment for me was when she's taking her earrings off, and I'm like, we are serious about playing with this jewelry. And so one of the other things I talk about with students is, you have to practice to know what it is that you're going to futz with, right? Am I going to play with my glasses? Am I going to play with my sleeves? Am I going to take my bracelets off? Am I going to do stuff? Am I going to play with my rings? Like, one of the things for me is, as I'm thinking, I'm pulling on my rings. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to be aware that you do it. Because there may be behaviors that are problematic. So, for instance, I had one student last semester, and I was really sort of amazed by this, and she spent the entire speech doing this. Right? And when we talk about how we convey confidence, this is not confidence in any way, shape, or form. And her classmates actually, because they were doing audience reactions at that point, a number of them said, it was really hard to watch. I couldn't figure out what she was doing with her hands. And so, you're right. You have to balance that comfort with appropriate presentation. I have rubrics that I do for students where, there were specific elements to an assignment that they needed to have in there, and so I circle a yes or a no. There's no maybe about it. You either did it or you didn't do it, right? There was an intro, there was not an intro. Because all of this is to give them as much feedback as possible. Because all of the research supports that the more feedback they get about those presentations, the better their presentations become, the better their public speaking becomes. Which of course makes sense. That's why we do feedback, in general, right? But that also then means that you need to give them opportunities to do multiple presentations if they're going to incorporate that. If you develop a rubric in a way, you can walk out the door having graded it already for them. And so maybe you fill in some extra kind of comments and stuff, which makes your life a little bit easier. But it also then, if you structure it, you can give them appropriate feedback. One of the things that I do for my students is I actually give them the notes of me writing down what they said. Because one of the things that I want them to see is you planned out what you thought you said, and here's actually how it came across. Here's actually what you said. So often my students get notes that have I flowed their arguments, right? So I literally said 1, 2, if they gave me 1, 2. So that they can see it visually, how it looked when someone was listening to their presentation. And then from there, make comments for them. There is research that talks about giving immediate oral feedback as well, but it's for students, but it's an as well as doing the written feedback back. My students laugh because I always give them assignment sheets that are like extensive notes. But part of that is because I want to provide them with kind of all of the guidance that I can to help them construct a speech that's going to be effective. And so, for instance, the one I really want to highlight for you here is about halfway down this, I have a paragraph. The speech should begin with an introduction that grabs the audience's attention and emphasizes the relevance of your proposition. I literally walk through what the speech should look like on paper in order to help them figure out. And the assignment sheet reflects my grading critique. It's a 1-to-1. So they get exactly the feedback. I set the expectations, and then they get the feedback around that. Not every class has the opportunity to do multiple speeches. You may only be able to let them do one graded speech. And that's okay. It certainly is something that has to happen. And so finding other ways to give them the opportunity to get critique and feedback before they actually give the presentation. So not only giving them opportunities for practice that maybe seems not like they're really practicing public speaking, but that they are, but that also opportunities to give them feedback about that public speaking. So the next page that I've gotten here is an example of an outline that I give them. It's a simple structured outline. And this again goes back to that extemporaneous speaking, so that they're not preparing full texts. What they're preparing is a full sentence outline. I've got an example of it's got a couple of markers in it that are important. The student wrote out what their transition was. So transitions are one of those really important organizational structural things in a public speech. Transitions don't just move you from A to B, they tell you what A has to do with B, right? Because we're building arguments here. So what's the relationship between A to B, and what's that relationship to the thesis? And the full sentence outline here is literally as it says, right? Main points get separated out. They get written as a full sentence, and whatever is the supporting material that supports that claim, which of course is then all leading up to the thesis. Here's an opportunity to give your students feedback before they even give the presentation. So have them prepare for you a full sentence outline that you take a look at and critique. And the comments that happen on the full sentence outline exactly reflect, right, the rubric, the grading rubric. So where's the audience adaptation? Are there key terms here that could be explained further? Here's an opportunity for a visual aid. So it's helping your students just even at that place. And it's a writing assignment, right? So I mean, an 8-minute speech is about 6 pages long of full sentence outline. So there's a way to develop that. I asked them to think about what role public speaking will play in their career. So name 2 or 3 things that they think that they will have to do in terms of public speaking, and then set goals around those things that they think that they'll be doing. So for instance, students are terrible at small talk. Terrible at small talk, right? Because small talk is actually really hard to do. So you can imagine in a business class, they're going to have to do small talk at some point in time. So make an assignment that's actually about small talk. I had a professor once create that she had a cocktail party in her classroom as an assignment. So they talked about business practices and how to behave and what you down to how do you hold a cup and a plate and shake people's hands, right? So all sorts of kind of funny things, but thinking about all of the different ways that we're going to have to engage once we leave here. Research about public speaking actually supports the fact that if you have students set goals for themselves before they engage in public speaking, so goals for their public speaking, the outcomes are actually, they actually develop those skills better because they've already set up for themselves what it is that they want to learn about public speaking, right? We have things that we want them to learn about public speaking, but they may have things that they themselves want to make sense of. And so I included here 2 examples of a self-critique and a goal setting. So you can actually have, it's sort of 2 assignments, I separated them out. So the first one is I actually videotape a speech and have them write a critique of their speech. So there's an opportunity for them if you're only having them do one speech where they get to reflect on how they did as a speaker and set sort of constructs for how I could become a better public speaker, right? So we've used the same speech to do multiple things. I do it in my classes for the first speech that they give. That gets taped and then they write the self-critique. And it sort of lists out, right, they're focusing both on delivery and content. Then the next part of that is setting for themselves, okay, now what is it that I want to accomplish for this class? 3 to 5 of those. And then when I critique their speeches, my comments are about those goals. So there's always a section in my critique section that matches up with. So I actually keep their goals. And then I can come back and say, you know, one of the things, I had a student last semester who said he wanted to be able to deliver a speech without any speaking notes. So he wanted to build up so he could give an 8-minute presentation without any speaking notes. And so every time we were talking about how was he practicing and how was he making those speaking notes shorter. So getting them invested in what it is that they're supposed to be learning out of this. Beyond the, I'm anxious, I want to become not anxious. All right, thank you so much. You guys have been awesome.